Question 3. Your financial analyst has provided you with the following information concerning two mutual funds. The usual information is right here. You were planning on constructing a portfolio by combining these two funds. The first question is, if your goal was to minimize risk, how would you allocate your funds? So whenever we read minimizing risk, we use minimum variance. Okay, so minimizing risk between D and E. So basically just use the proper formula. So that's what's on the formula sheet. All right, and this is the covariance term. So as usual, covariance term is equal to correlation times standard deviation D, standard deviation E. And if you actually do that calculation, this gives you something like 0.020736. Yeah, so just replace the numbers in that formula, and what you'll get is a weight for D of 120.75%. So we can find the weight of E. That's equal to minus 20.75%. So that's the answer of the first sub-question. Going to B, suppose that you can invest in any money market fund in which you expect to generate a return of 6%. I'm just going to write it down, risk-free rate 6%. Also, you can borrow money at a rate of 8%. So the borrowing rate is 8%. You're not very risk averse, so you decide that you will borrow money to leverage. So this is important because it will save us some time. So they say that we will borrow money. So we already know where we stand with regards to borrowing. To leverage your positions on both funds, you believe that all investors' investment decisions are guided by a quadratic utility function. Your risk aversion is estimated at A equals 0.5. All right, so the first question is, how will you allocate your funds in order to maximize your utility? So between borrowing asset E and asset B. So as usual, this is what we're told. So we're also told that we decided we will borrow money to leverage our positions. Therefore, we need to find basically P2 already, or the tangency portfolio using the borrowing rate. All right, so I'm not going to write down the formula, but it's the easiest to find on the formula sheet because it's the longest one. But I'm just going to put the answer right here. So the weight of the tangency portfolio using the borrowing rate, the weight of D is equal to minus 220%. So weight of E is equal to 1 minus weight of D. That equals to 320%. So the next step is to find the optimal allocation between the borrowing asset and the tangency portfolio. So first we need to find the expected return of that portfolio and the variance of that portfolio. So expected return, you should know this by heart by now. So 220% times 10% plus 320% times 16%. This gives us 29.2%. So we can do the same thing for variance. And if we do it, we'll find 36.76%. So as usual, all the full calculations are in the spreadsheet that I have sent you with those videos. Okay, so Now the next step is to find square. So that's, we call it the proportion to invest in the tangency or the risky portfolio. So equation is pretty simple. That's our borrowing rate of 8%. Okay, so that's our version of 0.5. And everything else is what we've just calculated. So solely for this, and I can write it down very quickly. 0.5, 36.756% is equal to 115 plus 36%. So finally, so as a next step, we can find the optimal allocation in each asset. So that was the initial question. What is uh, uh, so how will you allocate your funds between borrowing, equities, and bonds? So pretty simple. So borrowing asset. Well, how much are we borrowing? So that's the proportion in the tangency portfolio. So we are borrowing 1 minus that amount. So 1 minus 115.36%. So that gives us borrowing 15.36%. So in DINA, so this is what we're putting into the tangency portfolio, and tangency portfolio as a weight of minus 220%. So that gives us 115.36% times minus 220%, and we get minus 253.78%. Similarly for E, sorry, 20%, that gives us 369.14%. Voila, so that's for this subsection. Moving on to the next, C. Well, this one is pretty straightforward. Compute the expected return and standard deviation of that portfolio. So save the calculation for you, but I'm just going to write down the answer. So we get basically minus 15% times borrowing. So we are borrowing 15% at 8% cost of borrowing plus minus 253.78% times 10% plus 369.14% times 16%. And that gives us a return for the portfolio of 32.46%. Can do the same thing with the variance. We find 48.91% and standard deviation is equal to 48.91% is equal to 69.94%. So that's for question C. For D now, so determine the cutoff level of risk aversion 8 past which a rational investor will begin to invest in the money market fund. Determine the cutoff level of risk aversion past which a rational investor will want to borrow money. So we're basically asked to calculate AMIN and AMAX. So we already have everything that we need to calculate both of them. And that's basically what we've just calculated. We've already calculated this earlier for the tangency portfolio. So we have AMAX is equal to 29.2% minus the borrowing rate divided by where do we calculate the tangency portfolio? Oh, okay, so 36.756%. Yeah, I'm just getting confused. 36.756%, and we get 0.58. So we can do amin the same way. So basically um, same formula, but using, this is the risk-free rate so of 6%. And we get 2.11. Just double check something quickly. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that my calculations were correct. So we have Amin and Amax, so that this is what was asked of us. So for the final question, your broker does not allow you to buy on margin nor to short. How will you allocate your funds in order to maximize your utility? So the optimal portfolio that we just found implied both borrowing. So we were borrowing roughly 15%, as well as short selling. So recall that we were shorting stock D in the tendency portfolio. So if both are now forbidden, then we need to change our approach. So we know that our risk aversion A is too low to want to invest in the risk-free asset. So because you remember, our risk aversion is 0.5, and that's smaller than Amin, which we found was 2.11. So we're too risk tolerant to want to invest in the risk-free asset. In fact, we want to borrow, but we can't. Again, we saw something similar before. This is basically the second particular case that we saw in class. So if we can't borrow and don't want to invest in the risk-free asset, then we just pick a portfolio on the efficient frontier as if there were no risk-free asset and no borrowing asset. So we'll just use the formula for the optimal portfolio with two risky assets. So that formula looks something like this. So replacing the values in that formula we find for asset D, we want a short, and we want to put it when 300% in the most risky asset. And that's because our risk aversion is very, very low. Very low. So this is what we want to put in asset D, what we want to put in asset E. But again, recall that short selling is not allowed. So we cannot short sell this one. So we can short sell D. So if we can't short D, then the next best portfolio is putting this way to 0 and going 100% in that one. So the final answer is and that's for question 3.